Welcome to the Spoon Podcast, where we talk to the builders and makers on the front lines of the food tech revolution. I'm your host, Michael Wolf. This week's guest is Adam Yee, a food scientist, entrepreneur, and podcaster. I'm sure many of you have listened to or subscribed to Adam's podcast, My Food Job Rocks, where he's interviewed hundreds of people working across the food industry. I've been a longtime listener of his podcast, mostly because I find it so interesting to hear what it's like working in a different type of job. My wife always makes fun of me, gives me a bad time because I always talk about how I want to do another person's job for a day. And in a way, with Adam's podcast, he lets me do that. And so in this podcast, we talk to Adam about his own career trajectory. We hear about how he started his podcast, and we hear about his plans for the future of the podcast and his other new podcasts as well. So we're excited to be bringing Adam's podcast into the newly announced Spoon Podcast Network, which we announced on our last episode. And if you like this conversation, make sure to go to thespoon.tech/podcasts and find Adam's show so you can subscribe if you're not already subscribed. You won't regret it. All right, that's it for now. Let's get to my conversation with Adam. Adam Yee, how are you doing, man?
Good. How about you? It's a nice sunny day in California. A little bit cold though, I'll say.
I love the cold. I miss Las Vegas a little bit, where I saw you 2 weeks ago and you and I were eating way more sushi than we probably should have.
You know, our Japanese friends treated us to Wagyu and sushi, and it was so good.
We were consuming way more sushi than our Japanese counterparts. And I want to just say, because we don't want the food to go to waste, but in reality, you and I just love the sushi. We just couldn't stop eating it. So,
you know, if they're offering food and it's like at that type of restaurant, I'm chowing down. I have no shame in that.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, was this the first time you've been to CES?
Yes, it was. And I will say I didn't get into CES, but I did see a lot of, tech workers walking around. I've heard a lot of different conversations and got to meet some really cool people from Ajinomoto, which I thought was awesome. We had a really good conversation.
And so much of CES happens outside of the show floor. The meetings, the dinners, the sidecar panels, or mini events. So, and I'm sure you've gone to events like Future Food Tech where so much of that stuff happens outside of the stage area.
Yep.
So I think you did get to enjoy a little bit of that.
Yeah, I think the secret to any small company actually is to make a very cool event outside of the event. So even if you can't go to the event at all, a real interesting hack that you can do to like get really cool clients is just make an awesome event outside of the event itself. So people do this for Supply Side, for Expo West, for Fantasy Food Show. It's a really smart tactic if you can't afford like the boothing fee, for instance.
And people are in town, so why wouldn't you? Like right? So much of events is you just want to connect with people. And so that's why we connected. And so there's another reason besides just reminiscing about Las Vegas and CS for having you on the show. Is like you're actually a new member of the Spoon Podcast Network. We have been a longtime fans of My Food Job Rocks, which for those, many of you people know that podcast, know you, but for the people who don't know about it, let's talk a little bit about the show. When did you come up with the idea for a podcast?
Yeah. Oh man, this was so. Usually I write a review 8 years ago, but doing the math, I think it was 10 years ago actually where the idea started. And this is going to sound weird about like me in years, is that I thought I was a year older than I actually was. And my birthday was like 2 weeks ago, and I was telling people that I was older than I actually was, and I had to like backtrack. Anyways,
that's funny.
So
I like to tell people real quick. My mom, I'm adopted, and for like 7 years of my life, my mom had my birthday on the wrong date. So I always like to tell people my birthday used to be on the 17th, but now it's on the 18th. People always look at me, what? But anyway, it's funny that you thought you were older than you were.
Yeah, and as everyone knows, I'm not saying my actual age here because I want that to be a mystery. But so My Food Job Rock started 10 years ago. I was listening to podcasts. I was working at a company called Isogenics. We're developing protein bars, and I stumbled upon an article from a friend of mine named Nicole Gala. She was starting up her own kind of recruitment company called Food Grads, and she wrote a really good article about kind of how it's hard to get the food industry to convey that their industry is cool. So at the time, tech was really cool. Is it still cool now? That is actually debatable, but it's still cool. What am I saying? There's so many cool things going on right now. But that article specifically said, like, how can we make food jobs as cool as tech jobs? And, I reached out to her and we got to talking. I was like, well, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts. I think podcasts are a great medium to convey that you're authentic, that you're interesting, and that you're cool. And so I pitched the idea of doing a podcast where I interview someone in the food industry every week. They agreed to it. They actually were the original kind of creators of the title My Food Job Rocks, actually. So I have to give them a
Got
lot
it.
of credit.
Yeah.
I think it's actually registered in Canada. I'm not sure. So if Nicole's still listening to this, or anyone of the Food Grads group, which I believe still exists, thank you for the name. It's really
Shout
helped me
out.
in my career.
Shout
But so every week I just interviewed people. I started with my friends. I basically went to California. I was in Phoenix at the time. Went to California, interviewed a friend of mine who works in Dandelion Chocolate, a food consultant, and a Safeway product developer. And those were my friends I knew since college, and just started there and had that set of episodes, then just pretty much posted them on LinkedIn. Eventually, I noticed a lot of scientists don't get a lot of engagement on LinkedIn, so I reached out to them, got them on the show because they were hungry for
Yeah.
engagement on LinkedIn, and just did that for like 80 or so episodes. And then magically what happened was PR firms started to find me on Google and asked me to interview their people. And I got just so many awesome guests from that. Like Penguin Random House. This is the peak of My Food Jar Box, by the way, is when Penguin Random House asked me to interview Harold McGee, who
Yep.
did the book on food and cooking. And he was actually launching a book called, it's something about smells.
On
Like,
smells.
yeah, on
Yep.
smells. Did you get that too?
Yeah, I actually interviewed Harold because I was kind of tied into the modernist cuisine movement, and he's a fundamentally instrumental guy for the foundation, a lot of the foundational kind of thoughts around applying science to cooking.
Yeah.
And so he was in that universe. And so when his new book came out, he did a tour. So, but I think it's really cool that they reached out to you and asked and pitched
crazy.
Harold.
It was crazy. Best interview I ever had, honestly. Like, just understand, like, this guy, like, Harold is, I think he taught me one thing, is that you don't have to be an expert in food to like food, right? Or to love food. And I think him making that book about this, and talking about how his success actually came from a magazine. Like, people found his book from I think a woman's magazine of some sort, and then it kind of built from there. So, but he's like generally, like, I think a poet, if I remember correctly. He just has a very differential background, and that really inspired me to think about careers differently, in a sense, where someone so influential in food doesn't have to be technically in food.
And you interviewed, I feel like, almost every different type of role across the food system, pretty farm to fork, different parts of the food value chain, but also the different roles, whether that's scientists, you probably interviewed chefs, etc. Because I think your podcast numbered in the hundreds for My Food Job Rocks, right?
Oh yeah, it's over. Yeah, over 200. Like, I think Apple says I've done around 300 episodes. So
Yeah.
And I've done plenty of other podcasts, some really quirky podcasts, some just things I want to try out on my own, like an actual play role playing game podcast that was really hard to do, but was extremely rewarding in a technical perspective. So I really just love podcasting. It's an amazing medium. I learned so much from it, and I just get to make interesting content with really cool people. That's my favorite thing about it.
You became known by the podcast, but you had your own career along the way. You were doing startups and went to a few different spots along the way. Give people a little background tour of what your career has been like as a food scientist.
Definitely. And I'll say this, I get this pitched a lot from student groups, actually. So when I go to like universities, I talk to them about my career path with the common kind of understanding is that, like, take risks and do a lot of things along the way. So I got my bachelor's in Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, and then I decided to move to Phoenix, Arizona to work at a granola bar factory. And this was a co-packer. They did Costco granola bars, a lot of Costco granola bars. There was a point, and they just started this factory up. Like, so there was a lot of problems, and I had to be the one who knew all the solutions, even though I didn't, being a fresh grad.
So
But it
this was
a lot
a
of fun.
factory building, mainly just to pump out granola bars and protein bars for Costco.
Mainly granola bars. We did a little bit of dog biscuits, which was another story. Love to get into that eventually in the future. We did a lot of very interesting crackers, fruit-filled bars. It was basically a huge factory where we could try a lot of new things, which I thought was just very rewarding. And there were times where they would just ship whole production lines, set it up, and then tear them down just to test something. And it's wild. But in general, what I found very valuable at the job was just how hardworking workers are. The people who make our food specifically, they don't have the education like I did. They did not have the same background of financial security that I did, and they worked extremely hard. I remember like a 50-year-old Hispanic lady, like, would carry 50 pounds of sugar up a stairs probably 30 times a day to dump it into a giant vat of molten liquid just to make syrup for granola bars, right? So that taught me just a ton about who makes our food. I was only there for 1.5 years, and I'll just tell you, like, a lot of the stints I've had are relatively short, I would say. But I just learned so much from that, and I was able to take that experience. And one, it was a hard job. I had to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, start the line because Phoenix was so hot that they had to start at a cooler time, for instance.
I've lived in Phoenix. I know those hot days in the summer.
It's brutal, but it was a tough job. But it was almost like kind of this training that I'm really glad I had, because it was foundational to how I view making products, actually. And I took that to a company called Isogenics, which was also in Phoenix. Had a beautiful headquarters when I was there. Great team. Really rewarding, in terms of like the factory work, like having a cushy office job designing protein bars was so nice. And it was so great. I had a great mentor who was the chief science officer over there. Just taught me a lot about corporate, taught me a lot about, climbing up in the world, and gave me a lot of opportunity to innovate and test out my own ideas when I think a lot of scientists didn't have the ability to do that. And I was able to create, like, that's where I kind of went in my first foray of plant-based, was actually reviving a plant-based protein bar that was kind of in this graveyard area for a bit, and was able to launch that, and was a really, really awesome experience. And it's just started to be known as this protein bar guy, actually.
The protein bar guy. But and at some point, your podcast, I think, led to a job opportunity, because I know you met Paul Shapiro, who's also a podcaster.
Yes.
Right?
Well, no. This is a good story. Paul's podcast was actually inspired by my podcast.
Oh, I did not know that. That's great.
And now he's much better than me. He talks to much more interesting guests, and it's so amazing just how far he's gone with that podcast. But when I interviewed him, actually, when he launched his book Clean Meat, and I was so shy to actually talk to him, because I had to ask a referral to get him, because he was an author. And I thought my podcast was too fledgling, but then I realized, like, the best time to get people on your podcast is actually through a book tour. I interviewed Paul, awesome conversation, a great foray in understanding food technology. And then 3 months later, I think I was emailing all my guests about Expo West. He reached out saying if I knew any food scientists that could help him on a project. I said, well, I'm a food scientist. I can help you on a project. And that's how we started Better Meat Co. And through that time, we did some awesome stuff. I know you did an interview with him recently where he told the whole story about it. And I think one of the things that wasn't well known is that we were he was talking a lot about podcasts. I was talking about how podcasting helped me network. It helped me learn about new things. It helped me do all this. And he was really inspired to do it. So he started his own. I helped him a little bit. But it was definitely an interesting thing, and I'm very happy to have kind of inspired a lot of people to get into podcasting. Whether or not the shows are still alive or not, it's still worth it to try something like this, because it's just such a great expressive medium for not a lot of work, honestly.
But I think for authors in particular, I like to think of it as almost open source journalism, in that if you're going to be researching a book, it just makes so much sense to record those conversations, because you're oftentimes talking to interesting people. And you can, in a sense, open source the book writing process by recording those conversations and publishing them along the way. And a lot of those insights ultimately make it into the book. So I think for Paul, it makes a lot of sense to have both of these in tandem.
Yeah, I think he's a very curious person too. So I think in general, he just likes, I think with Business for Good, for instance, it's not just food companies. It's more impactful than just food companies. It's everywhere. And I think his insight on that is actually important, where I want to kind of progress forward a little bit in my career. But I will say that what's great about podcasting is actually you have more influence in a book nowadays. Like, the medium has changed dramatically. I was chatting with Neil Zacharias. I actually had never met him before until recently. But we talk shop. And one of the things that he told me was that, and by the way, he does the podcast Eat for the Planet. We talked to a lot of vegan entrepreneurs. But he said, like, he originally did podcasting for his book, but now his podcast is more popular than his book. You know?
Books have a fairly limited shelf. I mean, they'll be around for a while. They can have long legs, but a lot of
Mhm.
times they pop in like the 6 to 12 month period. And how many people read anymore? Some of us still read, but more people I think listen to podcasts. It's a bigger audience.
Yep.
And you can be voracious in your listening, right? You could go through a lot more podcasts than you can books.
Yeah, I think nowadays people are doing both. Most authors, I think, actually do both.
Mm,
And now
yep.
with the technology with podcasting, you can take a lot of your transcripts instantly and get information to put on your next book. So it's almost like this feedback loop. Books have their place. I also think they're a very strong business card. I've noticed. It's like here is a book I made, and then people are like really impressed by it. I did a weird self published book too, in the games industry, and people were very impressed by that. Right, so there is still some power in books, but
Yeah.
podcasting just gives you much better reach
It does
and
open
depth.
doors. It does
Yeah.
open doors.
Hmm.
And it's weird because like the Spoon website has a lot more readers than my podcast has listeners, but people always talk to me about how they hear the podcast. So I'm
Yes.
sure you've had that experience about people come up to you say, hey, or they think it's weird that they hear your voice and talking to you in person, which is always fun. So you continued to podcast, and
Hmm.
at the same time, you worked with Paul, and then eventually you had your own company. I think Sobo Foods, where you basically developed dumplings, right?
Yes. So I did a little stint in food tech as well. We can't forget the
Motif.
the Motif Food Works, which
Yep.
I love to talk about this now because it's kind of like this peak food tech era
Yep.
where they just
It
raised a ton of
was. It
money.
was peak food
It
tech.
was peak food, and it was a great job. I'll tell you that it was a great job. Learned so much from really smart people. Got to see kind of uh, such a hubris in action. I would say there were some interesting things they did that I thought was without the money, would they have done this? The answer is probably no. But I would say it was just such a fascinating. I love Boston so much, and I
Mm,
love the people working there. Honestly, the people I worked with at Motif were the brothers in arms that I made there are phenomenal. Um, but during that time, actually, I was talking to another Asian American entrepreneur, and I got that itch again for starting a company again, and I had to do it. Now in hindsight, because I did leave Sobo Foods recently, is because I wanted to understand the consumer packaged good industry um, really intently. And that was the only thing in the food industry, besides maybe academia, that I just did not understand quite well. And honestly, CPG or consumer packaged goods it's such a rewarding field, but it's also a very punishing field. It is a much harder
yeah.
to start a CPG company than any other food business. And food is generally just very hard in general. And so that's kind of how I viewed it. And I do want to put the segue on the transition between Motif and Soba Foods. Is I took a hiatus when I joined Motif, but I brought the podcast back to travel around the world and
Yeah.
interview these amazing people in like 9 different countries. And Mike, I have to thank you. You introduced me to Hirotaka and Akiko, which now we're really
Yep.
good friends
In
in
Japan.
Japan. Yeah,
Yep.
and and like that was something I noticed, that the power of podcasting was the network at the end of the day. It was not only because I had kind of this branding of being a podcaster, but also because they knew that I could deliver. I don't know if they knew this, but they found, I think they liked it that I would ask them for like context so I could interview them and get their perspectives. I learned so much about the world on that 3 month sabbatical in 9 different countries, especially in how food plays a role in it.
Yeah, I'm glad I could be a part of it. It's a lot of interesting backstory about how you were trying to get in and out of different countries during the time of COVID,
Yeah,
and travel
one at a
visas.
time,
But
one at a time.
it was great that you did do the Adam Yee global world tour of interviews, which
Yeah,
was a lot of fun.
it was so
But
cool.
it was super cool. And so some of those podcasts, you can actually still find them all. I was just listening to the one with Akiko
Oh yeah,
from Sigmaxis, are one of my partners in Japan. But you are bringing back My Food Drop Rocks. So you're going to be digging more into hearing the stories of people building stuff. Now, the future plans for My Food Drop Rocks, are you planning to expand outside of food or food adjacent jobs, or is it primarily still going to be focused on food? What are you planning on?
yeah. So I realized after Sobo Foods, I still don't know the food industry that well, despite probably knowing more than the average person about the different jobs
Yeah.
of the food industry. You mentioned farmers. I think I only had like 1 or 2 farmers. I interviewed a venture capitalist recently, and he said like, "Oh, you only had 2 venture capitalists on the show," and that tells me that there's still so much more to explore. So with my food job rocks in this new iteration, would you call this season 2? I'm not sure. I want to talk to more people. That's kind of number one. Understand their career paths. I think that's vital and important, and it always is changing, especially in this day and age. Two, reconnect with old friends or people I've known in the industry for a long time. A lot of the discussions, and I have interviews until April in terms of them locked in. A lot of discussions were from kind of old friends and colleagues, from like my old professor or my professor in Cal Poly, or um, or returning guests, like
Yeah.
someone who really kind of shattered my world in food was kind of in the later season of my food job rocks. Michelle Klieger, who does he was an agriculture economics expert, and she just shocked my understanding. And and now I feel like I have a better worldview of the economics behind our food. So I want to interview more people like that. So my food job rocks is kind of not going wider but deeper into things. So one of the subsections we're going to make is called Dig In, and Dig In is specifically a portion of my food job rocks where we talk about more specifically a specific topic rather than a career path.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense, especially for those returning guests. And I love that you're going to be going into, maybe bring on some farmers.
Yeah,
Have you brought on many frontline workers, like in restaurants, et cetera?
that's
It'd be a
hard.
lot of fun.
That's actually really hard to do. Yeah,
Is it?
I wish to. Yeah,
And it's not just my food job box. You also have another podcast called Maybe Food, Maybe Tech. Talk a little bit about that.
yeah. So in Boston, I met now we talk really often. Her name is Kai Shin Wang. She is kind of the typical tech person. Went to a nice school, got a consulting job in Bain, and then now works at a really really big tech company. Starts with a G, and it was and we talk a lot. We had the same type of kind of argumentative energy, and we noticed we just talked a lot about food trends, or not even food trends, just trends in general, news. She was transitioning jobs at one point to the giant tech company, and she was kind of bored with the project. And I was like, oh, well, why don't we try a podcast? And so we started this very small mini podcast called Crisis Meets Opportunity, which we're both Asian, and she's Australian Asian. I'm Asian American. And Crisis Meets Opportunity, there's a word in there. I don't know. Some politician actually made this statement saying like, the Chinese letter for crisis has the word opportunity in it. And so we're like, that's fun. So we made that. We did it for around 70 episodes, actually. When I was traveling the world, I decided to do that podcast as well. It was just such a really good kind of talk with her about these current events. It made me realize the world is bigger than food. And I do think, like, especially in the food tech space, we can get kind of too in the weeds of just ourselves and not understand the bigger picture of what's going on in the world today. And when you signed us on for this kind of reiteration of crisis meets opportunity, I was like, okay, well, it should be food focused, and I'd like to be food focused in a way where we can relate current events like politics, like policy, like AI, or biotech, and how does it affect food? And there right now, one could say that it is affecting food quite a lot, right? Like we on Monday we talked about egg prices, right?
Mm.
And we had to dig in to understand the egg price situation. What we saw is that the avian flu is a big deal, for instance, and it's spreading and is killing flocks of chickens. And then we kind of digged into that, and then we also dug into like what technologies would actually help the egg crisis. And one of the things that we were talking about is like a lot of people are funding the alternative chocolate industry, and they might be funding the alternative egg industry. And one company that is poised to do that is, for example, Every, for that type of thing. So those insights and those connections are very interesting. Specifically to me, I just love understanding how these worldly things are happening, and just there's so many opportunities in food that I want to showcase to the world. So because eventually someone's going to figure out these opportunities, and I hope someone who listens to these podcasts takes advantage or understands these opportunities better to find essentially economic success by solving them.
It's a cliche, but everyone eats, right? And so everyone is interested. I feel like food spans all our different ideological divides because we all like to gather around, we all like to eat. But the context you're providing with Maybe Food, Maybe Tech, you really, I think, elucidated it well. Food is impacted by all these different outside forces, the price of eggs, energy prices, etc. By the way, what is China's new AI going to do in terms of impacts on our shopping experience? Like, it's obviously having a big impact on equity prices in the US, but all that context, I think, swirls around our food system. And I think that's really where I think you have an opportunity to kind of explain all those different swirling forces and how it impacts food. Cause I think that's really, really valuable.
Yeah, I hope it is too. And thanks. I would love to. That's why I like working with a network too. I feel like combining with our strengths, we can really be a valuable news source for people in the food industry, if they're specifically if they have a hard time understanding how the bigger world can affect either their job or what they want to do.
If people wanted to find out more about what you're up to, obviously they can check out the Spoon Podcast Network and go to spoon.tech/podcast, but they could probably find you on LinkedIn as well. Where else can they find out more about Adam Yee?
I'm all over the internet.
You're all over the place.
No, I want to be all over. That's actually a big focus on this year is being more present in the online space, whether that's healthy for me or not. Right now, I'm trying to figure out actually the right community. Most platforms have a different way of the audience is just different on most platforms and the way you interact with them on general. I'm looking at a lot of different things. I think video, for example, for podcasting specifically, is going to be a lot more important in the future. And I think that's something that I'm looking to putting resources in, for instance. Right now, I would say LinkedIn is the best way to find me. I post a lot of stuff over there. And, LinkedIn has just been really nice to just communicate with people and talk to people, honestly.
And if people have a really cool job in food, reach out to Adam. Yep. He can hopefully bring you on the podcast and hear a little bit more about what you're doing. So, but Adam, thanks for telling us about what you've been up to and a little bit about your career. And we're excited to have you on the network.
I'm so excited to be building this together.
All right. Thanks, Adam.
No problem.
That's my conversation with Adam Yee, longtime food scientist who's been podcasting to make connections and advance his career for quite a long time. And we're excited to have him join the Spoon Podcast family. If you haven't already, please rate and review the podcast in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really does help. And one more thing before we go to the spoon.tech/podcast to check out our new podcast network and the slate of shows that we have. You can also go to the link in the show notes to find out my story about why we decided to start a podcast network. If you like the stories and the conversations and the people we'll talk to on the Spoon Podcast, you'll love what you find on the Spoon Podcast Network. So I encourage you to check it out, subscribe to shows, and we just appreciate your support. All right, folks, thank you very much. We'll talk to y'all soon.
If you enjoyed this episode, why not share it with a friend? And don't forget to give us a 5-star review. You'll find more content like this on the spoon.tech/podcast.